Sophie was walking home in tears, her body soaked from the rain. The beautiful dress she wore for the solemn occasion stuck to her body. Her hair clung in dull strands along her face. Without even considering seeking shelter from the rain, Sophie thought it was better this way. The rain disguised her tears streaming down her cheeks, making them indistinguishable from raindrops. Ron! How could he? The man whom Sophie had always considered the bravest, most reliable and loving, was now hiding behind the back of his silent father, while his mother was not sparing with her words this evening. Absorbed in her unhappy thoughts, Sophie did not notice how she reached home. That's what stress does to people. The girl didn't notice that she had covered about 5 kilometers. Sophie stopped. She couldn't go home in this state. Her mother would start asking questions, worrying, and becoming anxious. It could even be dangerous. Helen had a weak heart, and her condition had worsened with age, especially recently. Sophie needed to avoid causing unnecessary worries. So she decided to go to the mall nearby, dry off for a bit, have a cup of coffee at the food court, recover, and then put on one of her complacent smiles before showing to her mother. Taking care of her mother had become second nature to Sophie since she was a child. Sophie had witnessed her heart attacks many times before. Sometimes Helen had even been hospitalized. They had no relatives to look after the little girl, and as a result, the young Sophie was often left under the care of neighbours for several days or even weeks. Once, Sophie overheard a conversation between her mother and her friend and found out that she had been forbidden from having children at all. Then, the girl, of course, asked her mother questions, and at first Helen denied everything, but eventually she confessed. "Yes, they warned me," her mother said, "but their predictions turned out to be wrong. They didn't believe I could carry you at all. They predicted I'd be dead by midterm. And then I thought, why should I live if I can't have you? You were already with me, living in my heart. How could I get rid of you? No, it was the truest decision of my life." Sometimes Sophie felt guilty, believing that it was her fault that her mother had such health problems. But Helen, noticing this, always got angry with her. "Don't even think such a thing. I always wanted to have a daughter like you, and I'm happy that I defied all predictions. And I was right, by the way. Yes, I have a heart condition, but who can guarantee it wouldn't have happened even without giving birth? I've had it since I was a child. At first, the doctors said I wouldn't survive pregnancy. Then they said I wouldn't survive childbirth. Later they assured me that you would end up in an orphanage at the age of 2 or 3. And what do we have now?" Helen often repeated to Sophie that she was the most precious gift that life had given her, and that having such a wonderful child was great happiness. Sometimes her mother would talk about Sophie's father. Sophie understood that her mother loved him deeply, even though she knew very little about him. They had met by chance, running into each other on the bridge. The handsome young man had come to the city for a student conference, while Helen was there on vacation for the first time in her life. She worked as a dressmaker in an atelier in a provincial town and had been saving up money for a year to go on this trip. The two young people immediately liked each other. They spent 2 days walking together on the picturesque streets of the city and sitting in cafes. Mick proved to be an intelligent and interesting conversationalist, captivating the young girl. Helen fell in love at first sight, and at the end of the 2 days agreed to go up to his hotel room. Both believed it was just the beginning of their relationship, but fate had other plans. They agreed to meet at the square at lunchtime the next day, after Mick finished his studies. However, Helen never waited for her lover. At first, she suspected that he had deceived her, but He looked at her with admiration, gently holding her hands. No, it couldn't be true. Eyes don't lie. The girl went to the hotel where the young man was staying. There she discovered that the students had been urgently taken away to some activity. You see, my daughter, he just couldn't come to the meeting. He couldn't escape. That's how we got lost. Sophie's mother sighed with a sad smile as she told her daughter the story. There was no social networks back then. No finding each other across the vast expanses of the country was impossible. We didn't have time to exchange addresses. I searched for him, tried to gather information about his city or university from the hotel staff. They refused, claiming it was confidential. I'm sure he was also trying to find me, but at least I still had you. How could I refuse such happiness? Remembering her mother's sad love story, Sophie settled down at a table that was hidden behind a column. She didn't want people staring at her right now. Crowds of people flowed on the upper floor of the shopping centre, including couples in love. Young people were hugging and smiling at each other, just like she and Ron had been doing not long ago. The smiling waiter brought Sophie her coffee and wished her a good day. He appeared friendly, but in reality he was indifferent. It didn't matter to him what kind of day Sophie would have. It was just his job. The only person in the world who cared about she was her mother. And her health was deteriorating. However, until tonight, Sophie held on to hope that Ron truly loved her too. He had told her so many times, but he was lying. Sophie savoured the hot summer aromatic drink, finding pleasure in its warmth. It made her feel slightly lighter, if only for a moment. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing that Ron had shown his true colours today. It would be much worse if their relationship became more serious, and only then would he reveal his true nature. Although, what could be more serious than what they had? Sophie had actually thought that he was about to propose to her. Why else would he suddenly introduce her to his parents? Wasn't that a sign of serious intentions? Sophie had recently graduated from sewing school and had become a dressmaker just like her mother. She had adored this craft since she was a little girl, dressing up her many dolls. She enjoyed coming up with interesting designs and selecting fabrics. It was like magic. A piece of fabric or a few scraps were transformed into a beautiful dress, turning any doll into a princess. Her mother worked long hours, leaving Sophie alone at home frequently, but the girl was never bored. Sewing distracted and entertained her, and brought her pleasure. Her mother, coming from work, sincerely admired her daughter's creations and predicted her career as a fashion designer. She even met Sophie's main masterpieces to her own atelier and showed them to her colleagues. But of course Sophie did not become a fashion designer. After finishing school, she attended sewing courses and became a seamstress. She now worked at an atelier close to home. She enjoyed her work and excelled at fitting outfits perfectly to the client's figures. Over time, she was entrusted with the most challenging cases, which she handled with ease. Sophie ordered another coffee to warm herself up. She didn't want to get sick and infect her mother. It could be very dangerous for her. Recently, Sophie had accomplished something almost impossible. She arranged a consultation with a renowned professor of cardiology, and it didn't cost her a thing. Her mother would undergo an examination by the best specialist in the field, who might prescribe a treatment plan to alleviate her condition. Despite being in her 40s, her mother struggled to breathe when walking, like a senior woman. The bathroom cabinet was filled with bottles of medication. All of this worried and frightened Sophie. And Ron distracted the girl from these sad thoughts. He transported her to another world simply by his existing. The son of wealthy parents floated through like a carefree butterfly, meeting friends, travelling, and partying. Always smiling and cheerful, he seemed to radiate optimism to those around him. And of course Ron was handsome, tall, athletic, and well-defined features, a wide, white-toothed smile, and charming dimples on his cheeks. He perpetually had a bronze tan on his body. Ron often travelled to soak up the sun and splash in the turquoise waves. In addition, Ron dressed stylishly and tastefully. He looked like a guy from a fashion magazine and could easily have become a model, but he had entirely different plans for his life. He was studying at a prestigious economic university, nearing the end of his penultimate year when he met Sophie. The upcoming year held a mixture of challenges and excitement for him: exams, writing his diploma, graduation, and then joining his father's business. His father was a well-known local businessman and owned a network of car services. What could possibly connect this representative of the golden youth and a financially struggling seamstress? Their fateful meeting took place in a nightclub. Sophie was not a fan of such places, primarily due to the high expense. She spent a quarter of her salary just to go to this club, which was quite irrational considering her situation. However, her childhood friend and neighbour Katie pleaded with Sophie to accompany her. How could Sophie refuse her? From the start, Sophie was not fond of the club. After taking a table, Katie immediately rushed to the dance floor. Sophie spotted her friend's silhouette amidst the dancing crowd and wondered what she found appealing about this place. The music was so loud that it felt like the eardrums were about to burst. It was stuffy, cramped, and smoky. But since she was already here, Sophie felt obligated to stay with her friend until the end. She couldn't leave her alone. Katie managed to coax Sophie onto the dance floor a couple of times. "Did you come here just to sit around?" Katie asked with eyes brimming with joy. And so, Sophie danced among the crowd of young people. It was indeed enjoyable to let go and surrender herself to the rhythm of the music. During one of these moments, Ron approached her. He stood next to her and started dancing, imitating and complimenting Sophie's movements. The girl felt embarrassed and stopped dancing, but he smiled warmly and took her hand, leading her in a dance. He felt so skillfully and comfortably that it felt as if they were one. It was an irresistible sensation. While dancing, Sophie stole glances at her unexpected partner. He was undeniably handsome, stylish, and impeccably dressed. How could a guy like this even notice her? Perhaps the dance would end, and he would smile and return to his equally affluent friends. But Ron didn't leave. He asked for permission to accompany Sophie back to her table. Since Katie was still considering the dance floor, there was no one at the table. The young man asked to join Sophie. The girl's heart raced like a jackhammer. She couldn't believe that such a guy wanted to talk to her. They tried to have a conversation that evening, but the loud music made it nearly impossible. Nevertheless, Ron managed to show Sophie with compliments she had never heard before. "You are incredibly beautiful and graceful. Your eyes are stunning. The moment I saw them, something inside me turned over." Ron said this while looking directly into Sophie's eyes, and he appeared genuinely serious. It was clear that he wasn't joking, but expressing what he truly felt. Sophie was bewildered. Previously, she had only received compliments about her undeniable talent for sewing. She had no idea that she was beautiful. In school, boys never paid attention to her. They only noticed her classmates, who had more prominent physical features, while Sophie was skinny, tall, and angular. In sewing school, there were no guys, and the same was at work. Therefore, it was the first time Sophie had received such delightful compliments that had made her head spin. Of course, she immediately fell in love with Ron. In her eyes, he was the most handsome guy on earth. However, she couldn't believe that anything could be between them. They were too different. Ron asked Sophie for her phone number, and she dictated it to him. He made a call to her phone to ensure she had his number, and then he escorted Sophie and Katie by cab. Katie tried to flirt with Ron all the way. She, heated up by drinks and bright emotions, did not immediately notice that Ron sympathized not with her. He politely deflected her advances, and this only made Sophie more captivated by him. Before saying goodbye, Ron kissed Sophie's hand. It was evident that he desired more, to embrace her, perhaps even kiss her on the lips. Sophie sensed his longing, but Ron restrained himself and settled for an elegant gesture. Despite this, Sophie doubted whether Ron would call her back. The next day was a day off, and Sophie felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. On one hand, she longed for Ron's call and to experience the same emotions as the day before. On the other hand, she feared his disappointment. What if Ron finds flaws in the daylight, finds her boring, or realizes they are incompatible? The thought of seeing disappointment in his eyes scared her. When Ron called, he suggested picking up Sophie in an hour and taking a walk in the park and getting to know each other better. He confessed that he couldn't stop thinking about her after their meeting the day before. Sophie agreed with pleasure and began to prepare for the date with excitement. She tried on all the outfits and even applied light makeup, which she rarely did. She wanted to hide her fidgeting from her mother so as not to worry her. However, the woman noticed and asked with a smile, "Going on a date? I'm happy for you. Just be careful, okay?" "Don't worry, Mummy," Sophie assured her parent. "We're going to a crowded place." Sophie chose not to mention that she would be riding in the car of someone almost unknown to her. She couldn't prove that Ron was a good man, but she had seen his eyes, and that was enough for her to realize it. Sophie was not well versed in cars, but when she saw Ron's luxurious car, she was amazed. It was a dark blue, glossy, and streamlined model. "The carriage is served." Ron smiled from the driver's seat. Sophie gathered her courage and got into the car. Despite the stark difference in wealth, Ron treated her sincerely, joked, complimented her, asked about her life, and shared about himself. Gradually, Sophie relaxed. Ron was natural, intelligent, and charming. He was nothing like the spoiled sons of rich parents. They took a leisurely walk in a beautiful park, admiring the fountains, feeding ducks, and laughing together. "I feel like I've finally met a soulmate," Ron shared his impression with Sophie. "You're so genuine, unlike anyone I've ever met." "What about others?" Sophie smiled. "Are they artificial or something?" "Exactly, artificial," exclaimed Ron. "That's the perfect word. Most girls are arrogant, demanding, and capricious. They see me only as a wallet and for my appearance. I can sense it. But with you, it's entirely different." These words warmed Sophie's heart. It was delightful to know that she was special to Ron, not just one of many. "Yes, I can only empathize with you," the girl joked. "I guess you've been hanging around the wrong people." "Apparently," Ron smiled warmly at her. Their romance felt like a fairy tale to Sophie. Ron made her surprises, showered her with compliments, took her to interesting and unconventional places in the city that she had never even known existed. He genuinely enjoyed her reactions, surprise, and admiration. "You're so easy to please, so easy to surprise," he would often say. "It's wonderful. I feel like an entirely different person around you. I can't even put it into words." Ron was deeply impressed by Sophie's sincerity and spoiled nature. He took care of Sophie, aiming to please and protect her. It was incredibly heartwarming. For the first time, Sophie felt like a real princess, beautiful, delicate, and loved. She had never viewed herself in this way before. Helen noticed the changes in her daughter and knew about her boyfriend, and she began asking questions, concerned about her daughter's choice. When she learned that he was wealthy, she became uneasy. "Be careful, daughter," Rich people often choose partners who are their equals, and with others, they just have fun and spend time. But what kind of stereotypes are those, Mum? Argued Sophie. Ron isn't like that. Besides, it's the 21st century, and you're still clinging to relics of the past. I just don't want him to break your heart, the mother said, shaking her head anxiously. But in the end, Helen was right. Time goes by, and nothing changes in the world. Perhaps Ron was initially captivated by Sophie. She was different from his previous girlfriends. Modest, unspoiled, hard-working, without any whims, obedient, and full of admiration. Especially, Sophie tried to please Ron by adjusting to his wishes and often agreeing with him, even when she had different thoughts. She wanted him to be happy with her. But they could not have a future together, of course. Only blinded by feelings, the girl refused to accept this fact. Sophie and Ron had already been together for almost a year. Relations between them had become more and more serious. She couldn't imagine life without him. And he also wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. However, Ron was finishing his studies, and his time was limited. One day, they were looking at Ron's photos from his travels. Someday I'll show you all this beauty. You'll look wonderful in a white swimsuit against the waves of the ocean. When I graduate, I'll announce that I have a fiancé. Fiancé? Sophie's heart sank. It seemed like a proposal. Of course, my fiancé, Ron nodded. What's wrong with that? It seemed obvious to me that we'd get married. It's not the right time yet, but the event is just around the corner. Sophie hugged Ron tightly, pressing herself against him and closing her eyes. She felt truly happy. Ron hadn't formally proposed to her. There was no ring or discussion of wedding plans. However, from that conversation, it was implied that they would marry sooner or later. After graduation from university, Ron started working for his father. As expected, he began earning a decent salary. Previously, his parents had supported him, which Ron never hid. Now he was becoming financially independent, which pleased him greatly. Sophie celebrated with him and dreamt that he would soon propose. However, several months passed after his graduation and still no proposal came. Then one day, Ron said that it was time for Sophie to meet his parents, as their relationship was serious. His family was eager to meet his chosen one. Sophie felt anxious about Ron's relatives. Family had always been important to him, and she didn't want to disappoint his parents. Darling, why are you worried? Everything will be fine. As always, Sophie believed Ron's words without any questions. He had proven to be strong, reliable, and decisive. If he said everything would be fine, she trusted that it would be. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. Sophie checked out photos of the restaurant on social media and grew even more nervous. She always felt awkward in such settings, although Ron had invited her to similar places before. However, this time, she would have to interact with his parents, and she wanted to make a good impression on her future in-laws, hoping for peace, harmony, and warm relations in their future family. Sophie decided not to inform her mother about the upcoming meeting to prevent her from getting excited. Lately, her health had been deteriorating. She often felt dizzy and had heartaches. Even just getting to work was a struggle, as she had to stop and catch her breath at every dozen of steps. The doctors were dismissive, telling her, "What do you expect? You have a serious condition. We warned you not to have children, but you didn't listen. The disease is progressing rapidly. We're not miracle workers. We can't perform miracles." Each time Sophie went to the hospital, hoping for a new effective treatment, she received the same response. But there was hope. A consultation with a renowned professor, arranged by Sophie, was scheduled soon. Sophie decided to take a bus to get to the restaurant instead of a cab because she wanted to save some money. Payday was still a week away, and most of her earnings for the month had already been spent on her mother's medicine. But the girl didn't mind the bus. She actually enjoyed riding on this public transport across the city, looking out the window. Sometimes she purposely chose longer routes to admire the city scenery and contemplate her own thoughts. However, this time, Sophie couldn't relax. Anxious thoughts kept winding through her mind. Intuition told her that the dinner wouldn't go smoothly. The bus was almost empty, as the rush hour had long passed. Sophie leaned her forehead against the cool glass and wondered if she should have worn a different outfit. The dress she wore was a decent length, but the shoulders were bare. Would Ron's parents consider it too revealing? Maybe she should have opted for a pantsuit instead. Sophie's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp shout from the conductor. And isn't it a shame to ride without a ticket at that age? Sophie looked towards the sound at the far end of the bus. An ugly scene was unfolding next to the driver's seat. The conductor, a burly woman with hair bleached with cheap paint and wearing an orange vest, hovered over a gaunt elderly woman. The elderly woman squeezed into her seat, tightly clutching a heavy bag filled with something, and glared at the conductor with defiance. "I'm telling you, young man, I'm going to the hospital to see my grandson. I spent my last money on treats for him, do you understand? I forgot to leave money for the ticket at all. It's such a pity if I quietly ride a few stops. The bus is empty anyway, and if it gets crowded, I'll give up the seat." "Whether it's empty or not, it's none of your business," the conductor angrily replied. "Your concern should only be paying for the ticket. Please pay the required amount or kindly leave the bus. If I let everyone ride for free, I would be fired." The elderly woman continued to explain that she was going to visit her grandson in the hospital and had bought him medicine, food and other necessities. She desperately tried to reach the conductor's heart, but the conductor remained stubborn, demanding payment for the fare or asking the elderly woman to leave. Sophie felt a deep sympathy for the woman who was so eager to see her grandson. The fare wasn't a significant amount. Though Sophie wasn't wealthy, she knew she could spare some change for a good deed. "Here, I'll pay for this, Granny," Sophie said, handing some change. The conductor looked at the elderly woman contemptuously and gave Sophie a ticket. Sophie immediately handed the ticket to the old woman and intended to return to her seat. However, the grateful passenger grabbed Sophie's hand with her dry, unexpectedly strong palm. "Thank you for your kindness," she said fervently. "My name is Mrs. Looper. Don't think I'm some beggar. I have a good pension. I've worked at the factory all my life. It just so happens that today I spent every penny of it. Give me your phone number, and I'll transfer the money to you as soon as I can." Sophie was taken aback by this surprise. It turned out that this old woman knew how to use mobile banking. Quite a modern elderly lady indeed. No, it's not necessary," Sophie insisted. On the way to the hospital, the old woman expressed her gratitude to Sophie and shared stories about her grandson Douglas. It seemed he was a very commendable young man. The grandmother was concerned about him as he had been hospitalized with injuries after a car accident. And then the elderly woman got off at her stop, and the rest of the way Sophie travelled in silence. The chatty woman had momentarily distracted her from her anxious thoughts and eased her excitement, but as soon as Sophie was alone again, her worries returned, manoeuvring in her mind. The luxurious atmosphere of the restaurant heightened Sophie's excitement. She immediately noticed the table where Ron and his parents were sitting. Upon spotting her, Ron greeted her with a smile, approached her, embraced, and complimented her appearance. All of this, of course, lifted Sophie's spirits. She always felt safe next to Ron. As it later turned out, falsely. Ron's parents looked exactly as Sophie had imagined them. His father, an athletic and well-groomed man, with elegant grey hair at his temples, had a tan and handsome features with dimples on his cheeks. It was clear who the son resembled. The mother was also well-groomed, appeared as if she frequented beauty parlours. Her face was smooth with flawless skin, impeccable manicure, and a regal posture and cold gaze from her light blue eyes. Sophie felt as if she had been hit by an icy shower when she looked at her. At that moment she understood everything on an intuitive level, although hope for a favourable outcome still lingered in her mind.
"Well, hello, dear young lady."
Ron's father greeted Sophie without a smile. "Good evening," the girl greeted with a broad smile.
"Finally we meet you,"
Ron's mother said, stretching her lips into a semblance of a polite smile, but her eyes remained serious and cold. Everyone introduced themselves, and the waiter brought their order. Initially, the conversation revolved around trivial topics: the weather, city news. Sophie inserted her own lines periodically, trying to be an active participant in the conversation. After each of her statements, Ron's parents exchanged meaningful glances. Sophie observed their reactions attentively, as did Ron. He looked at his parents' faces, trying to gauge their emotions. At that moment, he appeared less like an independent adult and more like a small child, and Sophie didn't particularly like that change.
"Tell us a little about yourself,"
Ron's mother asked.
"Our son is serious about you because he doesn't introduce us to every girlfriend he has. Although, of course, this is not the first time it has happened. Ron tends to fall in love easily. Nevertheless, I would like to know more about you."
Sophie was taken aback by the mention of "not the first time." It was clearly insinuated that she was not unique and one of a kind, but rather one of many. The tone of this wealthy, well-groomed woman was hostile, with a metallic edge to her voice, and so Sophie began to speak. Ron's parents occasionally asked clarifying questions about her mother, her father, her work, and her educational background. The girls' answers elicited a strange reaction from them. They exchanged glances and smirked. It was unpleasant. As for Ron, he sat next to his mother in silence. He didn't even attempt to lighten the atmosphere or support his girlfriend. "And why sewing school?" Ron's mother asked. "You probably didn't perform well in school, otherwise you would have gone to college and gotten a more promising field, wouldn't you?" Sophie let the barb pass by her ears. It was clear that this lady was trying to hurt her, to provoke a reaction, but she wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "Sophie did well in school, very well in fact. It's just, she had to start working earlier. Her family's financial situation was very precarious. However, she wasn't going to explain all of that to these people at the moment." Meanwhile, the conversation became increasingly unpleasant, with Ron's parents asking more and more personal questions and making unpleasant remarks. It felt as if they were dissecting Sophie from the inside out. The girl spoke about herself, but felt ashamed of her own biography, even though she hadn't done anything wrong to anyone. Ron's mother thus commented on everything that Sophie said, that the girl felt herself next to these people as a poor and limited dullard, who did not have enough brains for higher education, a lazy girl dreaming of getting a rich heir and thus solve her life problems. Or maybe that's what she really was. A sudden realization struck Sophie, under the unfriendly woman's icy gaze, that she really counted on Ron's help in the treatment of her mother. As for Ron, he remained silent, and Sophie felt betrayed, as he made no attempt to defend her. It was completely out of character for him, and left the girl even more confused. Ron had always been by her side, supporting and encouraging her. Now he resembled a scared little boy, afraid of his parents' disapproval. At that moment, Sophie realized the truth. She and Ron would never have a future together. His parents had made it abundantly clear to their son. Their goal was not simply to humiliate Sophie, but to show their only heir that she was not a suitable match. They wanted to ensure that their son understood that the girl, who lived alone with her sick mother in a small apartment, working as a seamstress, was not his equal. And Ron had learned this lesson perfect. He would never go against his parents' will. He was too dependent on them. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. Why did she have to endure this?
What had she done wrong to these people? She stood up from her seat and said, I figured it all out. I have to go. She wasn't going to burst into tears in front of that family. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Sophie hurriedly made her way to the restaurant's exit. No one tried to stop her. She still hoped against all odds that Ron would chase after her, because he had made it clear that he loved her, as he had repeatedly claimed. Yet Ron remained with his parents. Outside, the girl burst into tears. Fortunately, it was raining heavily, concealing her tears from others. Passers-by sought shelter under awnings to wait out the downpour, but Sophie continued walking, oblivious to the inconvenience. Her mind was in a tumultuous state. How could Ron do this to her? She had so much faith in him, believing that she had found her soulmate at such a young age, but it turned out that she had been deluding herself. Ron was only interested in her as a passing fancy. He was accustomed to dating spoiled princesses, and Sophie, a humble girl who had never experienced anything bright or exciting, must have been a refreshing change for him. It must have been gratifying for him to play the role of a generous benefactor, opening up a world of possibilities for the poor girl. Clearly, he didn't have genuine feelings for her. Otherwise, Ron would not have sat there like a statue, while his mother humiliated her before his very eyes. Now Sophie was sitting in a mall, drinking one cup of coffee after another. Her hair had almost completely dried, curling beautifully. Her dress was also almost dry, and she had regained enough composure to face her mother. She would act as if nothing had happened, even if her heart felt heavy. Her mother must not notice. She had to protect her, the only person in the world who truly loved her and always would. Perhaps all men were the same as Ron. They could sweet-talk and then discard you once they had had their fun. Maybe her own father had been the same. Sophie returned home and went straight to the bathroom. "Did you get caught in the rain?" her mother asked, lying in the bedroom and clutching her heart. It was aching again. "Yes," the girl replied with a careless smile. "I got completely soaked. I want to take a hot shower so I don't get sick." "I'll make you some tea." "No, you rest. I'll do it myself." In the shower, Sophie shed a few more tears. This time, they brought relief and washed away the negative emotions. Since that evening, Sophie had been acting like nothing had happened, but her mother still noticed the changes in her daughter. It was impossible to hide anything from her attentive gaze. "Did you have a quarrel with Ron?" "Oh, how did you know?" "Well, for one thing, you're not going out anymore. That's hard to miss. And secondly, you've been wearing a sad expression lately." "Yes, we broke up." Sophie nodded. "Turns out he's a bit of a mama's boy. Good thing I realized it in time." "Did he hurt you?" "No, I just saw that he's not the kind of guy I want to be with. I was upset and disappointed, of course, but it's all good now. The Ron I fell in love with never really existed, you know. I just imagined him. That's why I'm sad, but I'll be smarter from now on." Sophie smiled broadly, assuring her mother that everything was fine. But deep down, she was still in pain. Her dreams of a happy life with the man she loved had been shattered. Sophie still longingly remembered the Ron she had imagined before their meeting in the restaurant. She had thought he was perfect, and then she realized that such a person probably didn't exist at all. It was painful and frightening. Sophie tried to carry on with her life, working, meeting people and reading a lot. To distract herself, she constantly cleaned the apartment. The house was spotlessly clean, but her soul remained heavy and burdened. And then came the long-awaited appointment with the professor. Sophie went to the clinic with her mother. The professor turned out to be a tall, thin man in his 50s with sharp blue eyes. He carefully reviewed the medical history of the patient, said nothing, but ordered several additional tests. All the necessary procedures were carried out without waiting in the same clinic. Sophie was delighted with the attentive care. It was nothing like the local clinic. As it turned out, the professor was rushing for a reason. Out of his experience, he immediately realized the severity of the case. After all the tests, they returned to the office. The professor was ready to deliver his verdict. "Well, I have nothing good to tell you," he said, waving his hands. "I can't believe that such a quite young woman has such a condition. Your heart is worn out and barely functioning. Medication won't help. We need to perform surgery." Sophie gripped her mother's hands tightly as she listened intently to the doctor, trying to remain calm. "The surgery should have been done a long time ago. I don't understand how your primary doctor let the situation deteriorate like this." Irritation was evident in the professor's voice. "You could even consider suing him later, but for now the main focus is the operation." The professor then provided the details. The upcoming operation was complex, very complex. Not every cardiac surgeon would be willing to perform it on a patient in such a condition. Treatment in the capital was necessary, which meant travel, accommodation, and payment for expensive medications. And the operation itself cost some money. Insurance didn't cover everything. Sophie and her mother had no way of coming up with such a sum unless they sold their apartment and ended up on the street. "It must be done as soon as possible," said the professor seriously, looking at the bewildered visitors. "Every day counts." "What happens if I don't have the operation?" asked Helen. "I can't imagine where we would get that kind of money. Is medicine therapy an option?" "No," the doctor replied. "Medication won't help. Only surgery." On the way home, both mother and daughter remained silent, lost in their own thoughts. The woman faced a difficult choice: to fight or accept the situation as it was, knowing that the odds were stacked against them. Sophie feverishly searched for a way out, seeing no other option but to fight for her mother's life until the very end. Once home, the first thing the girl did was call every charitable foundation. Sophie hoped for their help and was certain they would assist, but no one was willing to help. She received different responses to her appeals. Some said that they only specialized in helping sick children, as if adults didn't face difficult situations or have a desire to live. Others gave unclear refusals, without providing reasons. Only in one place did Sophie get some clarity. "You see," explained the woman who answered the call with a guilty voice, "your situation isn't spectacular enough. People feel sorry for little children and donate money to them. They also help the mothers of these children so that they don't become orphans. But your mother is an adult, working, and she has already raised her daughter. So there's practically no chance people will respond to your request." Sophie was grateful to her interlocutor for this harsh truth. At least now she understood why all the funds were rejecting them. And it meant that they had to find other ways to overcome their difficult situation. "Mum, let's lower the price of the apartment so that we can find a buyer soon," the girl suggested. "What do you mean?" sighed her mother. "We don't even know if the operation will help or not. Plus, if we sell the apartment, you'll be left without a home." "No," Sophie exclaimed. "No, don't even think about it. We'll find the money." Sophie dedicated every free minute to searching for job vacancies. She was ready for anything to make money, but she quickly realized that this wasn't a solution. By the time she secured a job and worked for a couple of months to apply for a loan, precious time would be lost. Sophie felt desperate. She cried every day out of helplessness, concealing her tears from her mother. But Helen, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm. She appeared to have accepted her fate and didn't even attempt to do anything, knowing it would be futile. One day, Sophie took a desperate step. With no one else to turn to, she dialed Ron's number. Yes, they hadn't communicated all this time. Ron didn't call, didn't write, and didn't even attempt to apologize to his parents at the restaurant. It seemed he was content with the fact that Sophie had disappeared from his life. After everything that had happened, the girl despised Ron, reading him as a small-minded mama's boy. Even his name itself irritated her. She deleted all the joint photos so that she wouldn't accidentally stumble upon them on her phone. Those pictures hurt her again. She was so happy in them, so in love, and had no idea what lay ahead. But anyway, only Ron could help her. He was wealthy and would probably lend her the necessary amount, even with interest, just to get the money as soon as possible. The bank would never have given Sophie such a loan. Her solvency was too low. Of course, it wasn't easy to dial Ron's number, but it was for her mum's sake. If not for her illness, Sophie, of course, would never turn to him. Ron answered immediately. His voice sounded a little surprised, but the guilt or remorse in it did not sound. Ron spoke to Sophie as if nothing had happened, as if he had a former classmate suddenly called. "Well, hello, how are you?" the guy asked politely. "Not so good," Sophie admitted. "I hope you're not going to start telling me about your upset feelings now. I just don't like that sort of thing. It's all in the past. Let's move on." "It's not about my upset feelings at all," sighed Sophie. "You see, my mum, she's very sick. I've told you, remember? She has a heart problem." "I remember something like that. So what's up?" "Well, she needs surgery or she's going to die." "I'm sorry, that's sad. I hope she's going to be okay." "The problem is the operation isn't free. It costs a lot of money, and the insurance doesn't cover everything. We don't have that kind of money, and there's nowhere to get it." "Ah, that makes sense." Ron grinned. "Wow, my mum turned out to be a visionary. She warned me that this is how it will be." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked. "She said that since the fish is off the hook, you'll try to snatch your loot differently. Really, Mum, thought it would be a heartbreaking story about your own illness, or the news of your suddenly discovered pregnancy. But you brought your mother into it." Sophie was taken aback. Did Ron really think she was just trying to spin him for money? Did he completely understand nothing about her while they were dating? How can Ron say that? It's hurtful, painful, hard, unfair. And these reproaches and accusations of mercantilism hurt her soul. However, Sophie took herself in hand. She couldn't show weakness and take offence now. Ron was her last hope. "Ron, listen. It's all true. I can show you the medical papers, the professor's report, the price list of the clinic." "It's all easy to make up," the man argued. "The professor will call you himself. I'll ask him." "Are you kidding me? That call could be made by anyone. Do you think I'm a fool?" "Ron, it's true. I'll prove it. And besides, I'm not just asking for money. I'll pay it back. I'll pay both the debt and the interest. The main thing is to pay for the operation as soon as possible. They won't give me a loan. My salary is too small." "Well, how are you going to pay the debt then? You've said that you can't afford the loan." "I'll work part-time, day and night, but I need the money right now," Sophie said and looked with pleading at Ron. But he stayed adamant. "Yeah, that's a truly heartbreaking story, but it's a shame that such talent is wasted. You could write novels or play at the theatre." "Ron, it's true." "I'm sick of it," replied the man sharply. "Tired of listening to this nonsense, and after all, I initially still felt guilty that it all turned out so. You seemed, to me, a naive and sincere girl, and now I see that my mother was right, accurately predicted your behaviour. That's it. Don't call me again," said Ron, and hung up. Sophie dialed Ron's number again and again. She thought that she simply had failed to convey to him the seriousness of the situation. She should explain it better. He would understand. But Ron seemed to have blocked her number. That's all. The last hope evaporated like dew on a hot summer day. Sophie had no idea who else to turn to, and Ron again trampled and humiliated her, made it clear that he considered her as a fraud. Tears spurted from the girl's eyes. She couldn't and didn't want to hold them back. She had been crying a lot lately. Sophie was at the bus stop. Good thing there were no other people around. How would they react to a girl sobbing at the top of her lungs?
Sophie powerlessly sank on the bench, wrapping her arms around herself. Her whole body was trembling uncontrollably. It felt like hysteria. Sophie was exhausted from fighting, tired of being rejected, after knocking on every door. And then Ron. She had turned to the man who had once trampled and humiliated her, and he had done it again. But the worst part was that Sophie couldn't help her mum. Helen had become weaker right before Sophie's eyes, unable to even go to work anymore, and stuck on endless sick leave. The boss even threatened to dismiss her. Who would want such an employee? If it weren't for Sophie, her mother would be feeling much better now. Even the professor mentioned that the pregnancy and childbirth had greatly affected her health. Large tears streamed down Sophie's cheeks, making it hard for her to catch her breath as she tried to hold back her sobs. Suddenly, a car stopped right in front of her. Probably it was just someone getting dropped off at the bus stop. It happens. Sophie tried her best to calm down, not wanting to scare people away, but it was no use. The window of the front passenger's seat slowly rolled down, and Sophie met the gaze of grey, attentive eyes. It was a young man slightly older than Sophie. He looked at her with interest, while she continued to sob uncontrollably. "See, I was right. I've told you something was wrong with her. I noticed it from afar," came an elderly voice from the back seat. The man turned to the invisible stranger and absent-mindedly nodded, then turned his attention back to Sophie. "Hey, young lady, what's wrong? Do you need any help?" "No," Sophie objected. She suddenly felt ashamed for sitting and crying in front of these strangers. People had stopped because of her. They were surely on their way somewhere, maybe even in a hurry. "No, don't be embarrassed if someone offended you or something happened," the man continued. Just then the back door of the car opened, and an elderly woman stepped out. She wore a light pantsuit, her grey hair elegantly styled. This woman looked nothing like the lady on the bus, who couldn't afford the fare. But yet it was her, Mrs. Looper. Sophie recognised her. What a coincidence! It wasn't a small town. What were the chances of them meeting again? And yet it happened. "Oh my goodness, I know you!" Mrs. Looper smiled kindly and warmly. "Douglas, this is the girl from the bus. Remember, I've told you that story. The one who paid for me. I was on my way to visit you in the hospital." The man also got out of the car. Now the grandmother and grandson stood opposite Sophie, whose tears even dried up from surprise. "Well, of course I remember the story." The grandson smiled at his grandmother, then looked at Sophie. "Can you imagine? I had a minor accident. I had to spend the night at the hospital just for observation. I didn't even want to tell my grandmother, but it turned out that one of her friends worked there as a nurse. So she found out and dropped everything, bought a year's worth of goodies and necessities, and went to the hospital." "You're being sarcastic again?" Mrs. Looper reproachfully looked at her adult grandson. "But you'll understand me when you have a child of your own and put your heart and soul into him. Then we'll talk about unnecessary worries and concerns again." Sophie was delighted to witness this friendly banter. They were kind-hearted and caring people who clearly loved each other very much. "You know, for some reason, back then, I thought that your grandson was a boy or a teenager," Sophie confessed. "For me, he always will be my little one, even though he's already almost 2 meters tall and has long provided for himself." Mrs. Looper smiled. "Now what's troubling you, dear? Don't be shy, tell me. You're a kind girl who helped me back then and didn't remain indifferent. Maybe we can do something for you too." Sophie let out a sigh. How could these people help her? Sophie faced unsolvable problems, and no one in the whole world could assist her. Nevertheless, the girl suddenly realised that she really wanted to share her misfortune with someone. Douglas, his grandmother, they would listen to her, that's for sure, and at least sympathise, pity her. Sophie realised that all this time she had been hiding her worries from others. Even with her mother, she couldn't share her innermost feelings because of her bad heart. And here they were, potential listeners, asking her to open her heart. Well, that's precisely what Sophie needed. "So, can you finally tell us what happened to you?" Mrs. Looper asked again. "And aren't you in a hurry?" Sophie clarified. "My story isn't too short." "We're not rushing," the grandmother and grandson replied together. "All right," she nodded her head. "But before, I suggest we find somewhere nicer place to settle," Douglas said, looking around. "There seems to be a nice pizzeria over there. How about that?" "I'm in," his grandmother immediately responded. "Me too," nodded Sophie, frantically thinking about how much money she had left on her card. "That's great." The cosy atmosphere, stylish furniture and pleasant music in the pizzeria created a conducive environment for conversation. Despite Sophie's objection, Douglas insisted on paying for the order. They settled down at a table, hidden behind a rack of fresh flowers. "Now, tell us all about your troubles," smiled the elderly woman, "and we'll all think together on how to help you." "All right," Sophie nodded, still puzzled as to why these people would listen to her, let alone help her. So what if she paid for her on the bus? It's nothing. It's not worth even discussing. And Sophie proceeded to tell them everything about her life, with her mother in a tiny apartment, and about the constant feeling of guilt for her mother's illness, and the fears for her life and health that Sophie had experienced from a very young age. She mentioned Ron. She didn't go into details about the behaviour of Ron's parents, but simply mentioned that they made it clear she wasn't a good match for their son, and that she broke up with her fiancé afterwards. This part of the story wasn't particularly relevant, but Sophie felt the need to share. Parting with Ron still haunted her, and she felt the necessity to share her disappointment in her beloved man. "Rotten people," said Mrs. Looper. "Nothing good will come into their lives. They will marry their son off to a suitable lady, but there will be no love or harmony. I've seen many examples of this. Life will punish Ron and his parents more than once." Douglas said nothing, but he looked at Sophie with such sympathy, such empathy, that words were unnecessary. Then the girl talked about the consultation with the distinguished professor and his verdict. "And now my mum needs an expensive operation urgently. I've tried to find the money. I've done everything. I even turned to Ron, but he said that I was a scammer. That's why I burst into tears at the bus stop after talking to him." "What a fool!" exclaimed the elderly woman in her heart. "He doesn't know anything about people. I see you for the second time in my life, and I understand that you are a very honest and modest girl. Yet he has known you for so long and hasn't realised anything. He is a real fool." "In short, I have nowhere to get the money," summarised Sophie, "and without the surgery my mum... The girl couldn't bring herself to say the terrible word, but the listeners understood. Mrs. Looper put her arm around Sophie's shoulders and started stroking her head. Sophie cried again, unable to stop these foolish tears. For the first time, she was truly being listened to. For the first time, she was being sympathised with. That meant a lot. But the trouble didn't go away. The problems didn't disappear on their own, and money didn't materialise out of thin air. The old woman comforted Sophie with soothing words, making her feel better. Meanwhile, Douglas stared at them in silence, lost in thought. "How much money are we talking about?" the man finally asked. Sophie provided the figures, which were driving herself to panic. Douglas raised his eyebrows in surprise. "And there's no way this operation can be done for free?" "It can," replied Sophie, who had regained control of her emotions with the help of the kind woman. "You can get it for free, but you have to wait in line for almost a year. My mum doesn't have that much time." "Well, I am willing to contribute such a sum for her treatment," said Douglas. The grandmother looked at her grandson with pride and approval, while Sophie looked at him in surprise. Could Douglas provide such a large sum of money? He didn't seem like a rich man at all. He dressed modestly. His car was good, but not fancy like Ron's.
And besides, how could she accept such a generous gift from almost strangers?
I'm afraid I don't think I can accept that amount of money. It just doesn't seem right.
It's right and fair, reassured Mrs. Looper. You helped me in a difficult situation, and now Douglas is helping you. It's like a boomerang. Have you heard of it?
But the sums are very different.
So what? The elderly lady persisted. It's a matter of opportunities. Don't worry, smiled Douglas, placing his warm palm on Sophie's hand in a friendly and comforting gesture. I do have the means. Besides, I set aside a certain amount of money for charity every year. It's a firm rule. So... Sophie couldn't understand anything. If Douglas was such a rich man, why didn't his grandmother have enough money to travel with him? Douglas is a good boy. A successful businessman, proudly declared the elderly lady. I raised him from infancy after his parents died. I'm not even his real grandmother, just a lonely neighbour who couldn't bear the thought of my nice neighbour's child ending up in an orphanage. I took him in and raised him as my own grandchild. And he was smart and serious from a young age. I knew he would go far, and he did. Grandma never misses a chance to brag about me, smiled Douglas, but she's right. I've managed to build a successful business that generates a stable income. We specialise in custom-made furniture and have branches in many cities. Therefore, I allocate a certain amount for charity every year. Let this year be for your mum. Moreover, it seems like fate. Itself orchestrated our meeting. What were the odds of us crossing paths exactly when you were sobbing in despair and helplessness at the bus stop? Such coincidences just don't happen.
So you can really give us that much money? Sophie still couldn't believe her luck. But I just can't accept it for nothing. Let's make it as a loan. I'll repay the debt little by little until it's fully paid.
Oh, you're so stubborn, Mrs. Looper exclaimed, throwing her hands up. I understand your hesitation. Douglas shook his head, looking at Sophie with care. So here's my new proposal. I've been wanting to invest in a new venture for a while. We can establish a company for you, an atelier that specialises in custom-made clothing. Based on your story, it seems like you're a talented dressmaker. Your mum's medical bills can be a part of the investment in this atelier. Eventually, when the business starts generating profits, which it will, because I'm good at that sort of thing, you can gradually repay me from the investor's share of the profits. Do you understand? Sophie nodded. It all felt like some kind of fairy tale. Investments, a new company, an interesting job, and most importantly, money for her mum's surgery. Was this really happening? The girl was suddenly afraid that now she would wake up and it would turn out that she just saw a wonderful dream. But no, everything turned out to be true. They all exchanged their phone numbers. Call me when your heart feels heavy, said the elderly lady. And don't disappear. You're a wonderful person, and I enjoy talking to you. And then everything started to move quickly. Sophie's life was changing day by day. These changes even made her feel a little dizzy. First, Sophie's mother was sent to the capital clinic for surgery. Douglas not only paid for the necessary medical procedures, but also organised everything down to the last detail. He bought tickets, arranged rent for Sophie, arranged a comfortable room for her mother, and found all the rare medicines on the list. Sophie couldn't have done it herself, especially not so quickly. And Douglas, he solved all the problems as if by magic. He was truly wonderful. Douglas was a man of few words, especially outside of business. Unlike his grandmother, he was quite reserved. Often, Douglas and Sophie would travel together for work, and they would both remain silent. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was warm and accepting. Sophie was perfectly aware that she had been falling in love with him. Well, it was easy. He was just perfect. But every time she had these thoughts, she would restrain herself, because Douglas probably had a girlfriend. He wasn't married, there was no wedding ring, but surely he wasn't single. His chosen one must be perfect too. Some beautiful woman with a model appearance, a pure soul, and impeccable manners. Sophie could never compare to that. So, Sophie could only dream from time to time that one day Douglas would notice her as a woman, but these dreams remained impossible. Or so it seemed to Sophie. For 2 weeks, while her mother was recovering in the hospital after a serious operation, Sophie stayed in the capital. Every day she visited her mother, brought her treats and cheered her up. The doctor said the operation was successful and even joked that the patient managed to jump into the last carriage of the departing train. Just a little more and, well, Douglas and his grandmother came to save Sophie and her mother at just the right time. Douglas's grandmother was always in touch. She asked about Sophie's mother's health, rejoiced with the girl at her apparent improvement. She also suggested places to visit in the capital during Sophie's spare time. It was very exciting, as she had never been there before. Douglas would also often call, but their conversations were mostly business-related. He was busy registering a new company. Sophie was supposed to be its director and chief designer. This made Sophie slightly worried. Would she be able to handle it? No, she could design and sew new models. That was her talent. It was great that she would finally have the opportunity to earn money doing something she truly loved, something that inspired her. She had long felt like she was wasting her talent working as a simple dressmaker in an atelier. Fitting clothes to someone's figure was completely different from creating custom-made outfits. It was a way for her imagination to fly. But now she would also have to deal with paperwork and other issues, because Sophie would be the director and co-owner of the company. However, it was all right, she would manage. The most important thing was that her mother was saved. Now Sophie was going to do her best to make the company prosper, and that Douglas did not regret his decision. She would repay him the full amount and even more. Time passed and her mother was discharged from the hospital, and they both returned home full of plans and hopes for a new life. Helen looked like a healthy woman, full of energy again, and she even went back to her work as a seamstress, but now at Sophie's company. Sophie threw herself into her new business. The work was demanding, but it also inspired her and brought her joy. She couldn't be happier with what she was doing now. Douglas helped her with the documents and legal matters without even needing to be asked. It was as if he had some inner instinct that told him when and where there were problems, and he solved them effortlessly and playfully, just as he always did. Sophie fought with herself, trying not to reveal her feelings for him. He had saved her in a difficult and seemingly hopeless situation. Of course, that role as her saviour sparked romantic feelings in Sophie, but did Douglas need that? Probably not. He was just a good man who couldn't ignore the misfortune of a sobbing girl at the bus stop, especially when he had the means to help her. He was also a businessman who decided to try a new project, a tailor shop. It had the potential to be profitable, and that's why he got involved. Nothing more. Douglas was always serious, silent, and even a little gloomy. It was hard to imagine how kind and sensitive he truly was just by looking at him. He occasionally spoke harshly and curtly with his subordinates, especially with those he wasn't close to. Once he shared a bit about his life with Sophie. It happened one evening while they were up late working on a report. Douglas had lost his parents at a young age. Their wooden house caught fire. A vigilant neighbour, Mrs. Looper, had called the fire department in time. They arrived quickly, but it was too late to save the house. Douglas was fortunate. His mother put him down for an afternoon nap in a stroller in the yard, while she herself was busy in the kitchen. Unfortunately, a fire broke out, trapping both of Douglas's parents. However, Douglas was unharmed. The concerned neighbour who raised the alarm took the boy in. She had always admired Douglas's parents, considering them hard-working and a good couple. She often spoke highly of them and their ambitions for success. They could have achieved so much in life if it weren't for the fire, she would occasionally lament. Now you have to live for 3 and fulfill all your parents' plans and dreams." Douglas took this to heart and worked hard to make his parents proud. He excelled in his studies and even found time for hobbies and extra classes. Even as a child, Douglas showed talent in making simple furniture. At the age of 15, he and a few friends sold their creations in his garage. The lightweight chairs and tables quickly sold out, and Douglas received his first future orders. Gradually, Douglas established his own production, and by his 20th, he had his own company with employees and suppliers. He then decided to attend a local college to learn how to properly and legally conduct his business. He successfully listened to the economic program and eventually expanded his little company. Sophie was even more interested with Douglas after hearing his story. What an incredible man! From making homemade furniture to owning a network of furniture production. Amazing! Lucky for his girlfriend, I wonder what she's like. And how does she feel about the fact that her beloved literally disappears day and night to work with his furniture mini empire, and now with my atelier, thought Sophie sometimes. Over time, she became more business savvy and started handling most issues on her own, without relying on Douglas's help. She even fulfilled her long-standing dream of getting her driver's license and buying a car. Sophie was a cautious driver, but unfortunately she couldn't control the actions of other reckless drivers on the road. One day she encountered a driver who was breaking the rules of the road. It happened at an intersection, and the airbag failed to deploy. Sophie hit her head on the steering wheel, resulting in a minor forehead injury. An ambulance arrived and took her to the hospital, where she received a few stitches. As Sophie sat in the treatment room and the surgeon worked on her forehead, because of the painkiller, she wasn't feeling any pain, and her mind was preoccupied with the damage to her car. When the tow truck took the car away, Sophie didn't have a chance to see the extent of the damage, but it was clearly more severe than her own injury. After the surgeon finished, Sophie was moved to a hospital ward. "Can I leave now? I feel fine, and there's a lot of work waiting for me today," she asked. "No," the doctor shook his head. "You'll need to spend 24 hours in the hospital to rule out a concussion." Sophie was bored in her ward. She had told her mother that she would spend the night at her friend's house, not mentioning the accident. Sophie, as usual, tried keeping her mother far from stress, even though her health was not a cause for concern anymore. As Sophie was lying on the bed scrolling through her newsfeed, the door of her ward opened with a loud noise. Douglas stood in the doorway, his hair dishevelled and anxiety in his eyes. Seeing Sophie staring at him in surprise, he jumped up to her and hugged her tightly. "I was so afraid of losing you." A wave of warmth washed over Sophie as Douglas spoke these words sincerely. He cared about her. She pressed herself against him with delight. She had dreamt of this moment for so long. "I was afraid something serious had happened to you," Douglas said, pulling back slightly and looking into Sophie's eyes. "I saw a photo of your mangled car in the local news. I recognized the license plates. It said that the driver was taken to the hospital in serious condition. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." "I'm fine," Sophie smiled. "They exaggerated a bit to make it more interesting for people to read. I just have a scratch on my forehead. The doctor put a couple of stitches, that's all." Douglas smiled back. "Well, I guess there's no point in hiding it any more. I didn't tell you anything because I didn't want to embarrass or make you uncomfortable. I don't know when it happened, but I developed feelings for you. Maybe it was when you told us about your trouble at the pizza place, or after, when we organised your mum's treatment together. I don't know. But you are the sincerest, honest and beautiful person I've ever met. When I heard about the accident today, I was so scared of losing you forever. It was a fear I've never experienced before." Sophie smiled back at him. She would find the words to express her feelings to Douglas, but for now, she knew he could see everything in her eyes. "Well, now you're in the same position as your grandmother once was. Sophie smiled. Remember when she said at the bus stop that someday you would understand her. You would understand how scary it can be for your loved ones. Well, that day has come. It's true. Douglas's eyes lit up with a cheerful light. Granny, as always, was right. And so it is in everything.